Wasn't folklore, it wasn't a cautionary tale whispered to frighten children in villages or a twisted exaggeration from anti-clerical rumors. What happened behind the thick walls of certain monasteries and inquisitorial chambers was far worse, not because of chaos, but because of control. People were buried alive, not in secret graves or hasty burials, but inside structures designed to look holy from the outside, behind chapel walls, beneath altars, inside cells that once held prayer. And if you stood close enough at the right hour, you could hear it, the faint scratching, the gasping, the muffled fists thudding softly against stone and wood, not from ghosts, but from people still alive. These burials weren't carried out by lunatics in the dark of night. They were organized, documented, sanctioned. The Inquisition, that arm of religious authority empowered to purge heresy, didn't always need fire or sword. Sometimes silence was enough. A woman accused of speaking too freely about scripture, a monk who doubted doctrine, a layperson who refused confession. Not everyone was burned, not everyone screamed publicly. For some, the punishment was quieter, longer, and more psychologically perfect. They were entombed with air, water, bread, and nothing else. No light, no sound, just time to beg for forgiveness into stone. Time to claw until the skin under their nails shredded. Time to realize that no one was coming. The architecture itself aided the cruelty. Beneath some medieval chapels were hidden vaults and crawl spaces, built not for storage, but for disappearance. Some were no larger than a coffin. Others were standing rooms barely wide enough for a person to turn their shoulders. Once inside, the door was sealed with stone and mortar. In some cases, a pipe was left for air. In others, that too was closed after a day or two. The result was a death not of fire, but of breath and of memory. These weren't martyrs. The church didn't want them remembered. These were people meant to be erased, and so there were no trials. No tombstones, no graves, just walls where, if you stood long enough, the silence would grow so thick it felt like it could crush your chest. But sometimes the silence broke. There are stories from novices, young monks entering the orders who heard something during evening prayer. A tapping, rhythmic and faint, like a bird trapped behind the altar, like a heartbeat inside the wall. They would report it. A senior brother would nod and say nothing more, and the sound would stop after a day or two, because someone inside had finally gone still. Others told of entire walls trembling lightly in the night, like someone on the other side was using their last ounces of strength to say, "I'm still here," but no one answered, because to answer was to question God's judgment. To question God's judgment was to risk becoming the next sound behind the stone. These punishments weren't whispered about at the time. They were written down not emotionally, but bureaucratically. Pona viva sepulturi, one record states, the penalty of living burial, no elaboration, no apology, just a date, a location, sometimes a number of days until death. The rest was left to be endured in darkness, in hunger, and in the knowledge that everyone above you was pretending you didn't exist anymore. So yes, people were buried alive, and yes, others heard them scratch. And the most terrifying part, no one stopped it, because no one thought they could. The Inquisition was not chaos, it was choreography. From the outside, it looked like order. Files were kept, rules were followed. Testimonies were transcribed in careful Latin. The accused were called not criminals, but souls. The process was wrapped in the language of salvation, of guidance, of grace, of spiritual cleansing. But behind that vocabulary was something else entirely. It was control. And not just control over what people did, but what they thought, what they feared, what they were willing to admit, even when there was nothing to admit at all. This was the genius of the Inquisition. It didn't need to prove you were guilty. It just needed to convince you that guilt was inevitable. That innocence was pride. That silence was rebellion. The moment you entered the process, your role was already written. You would confess whether it was true or not, and if you didn't, the methods would escalate until truth became irrelevant. You were no longer a person to be understood. You were a problem to be resolved. The tribunal chamber wasn't just a room, it was a stage. Witnesses sat behind grates, unseen. Judges wore robes, not to protect themselves, but to embody divine neutrality. The accused stood alone. There were no lawyers, no advocates, no presumption of innocence. Questions were posed as tests, answers were dissected, silence was taken as defiance, anguish was mistaken for deceit. The more human you became, trembling, confused, desperate, the more they believed the devil had hold of you. And when the questioning ended, the spectacle began. Torture was not a dirty secret. It was written into law, justified by doctrine. The rack, the strappado, the thumbscrew, they weren't used to punish, but to extract. Confession wasn't just desired, it was required, even if they had to shatter bones to get it. But for all its brutality, torture wasn't the Inquisition's final weapon. That was reserved for something far more devastating, public penance or public annihilation. When they burned people, they did it in daylight, with drums. With processions, with clergy in embroidered vestments chanting prayers as the condemned, barefoot, shaved, shackled, were marched through city streets. The church didn't kill in secret, it killed ceremonially. Because the point wasn't just to destroy the heretic, it was to remind everyone else that this is what happens when your thoughts wander too far from the script. And yet, for all the noise, the blood, the fire, the most terrifying punishments were often silent. They didn't involve spectacle, they didn't make crowds scream or cheer. They happened in dark corners, beneath floorboards, behind sealed walls. There the accused weren't given martyrdom, they were given nothing. No audience, no fire. No release, just darkness, days of silence, followed by years of being forgotten. Because that's what the Inquisition understood best. You don't always need to burn people. Sometimes it's enough to make them vanish. And when they're gone, when even their name becomes too dangerous to mention, the world moves on as if they never existed, as if they never scratched at the wall in the first place. They didn't bury people alive to make them suffer quickly. They did it to make them disappear slowly. Death by fire was brutal, yes, but it was also immediate, visible, and strangely dignified in its finality. There were witnesses, prayers, and smoke that rose like some perverse sacrifice. But being buried alive stripped all that away. It wasn't just execution, it was erasure in progress, a kind of dying that took days, not seconds, a ritual where no one came to watch because no one was supposed to know. The horror of being buried alive wasn't the darkness, it wasn't the dirt or the stone walls pressing in, it was the sound of your own breath echoing in a space too small to stretch. The sound of your fingernails snapping as you clawed at wood, at brick, at anything that might give. The sound of voices muffled above you, continuing life as normal while you slipped out of it, inch by inch. And worst of all, the sound of yourself, praying, bargaining, screaming into silence until your voice cracked and your throat bled and still no one came. That's why the Inquisition used it, because it wasn't just death, it was dismantling. It took everything the person believed about justice, about God, about the world, and tested it against stone. There was no last chance to explain, no priest at the end, no absolution. Only the certainty that your life was ending while the world continued as if you never existed. Psychologists today call this death anxiety, the fear of non-existence, the fear that nothing you were will be remembered. The Inquisition understood that long before it had a name, and they weaponized it. To be buried alive wasn't just a sentence. It was a statement: you are not even worth burning, you are not a warning to others. You are not a danger we need to show, you are a problem we will make vanish. This form of punishment wasn't used at random. It was selective, applied when the church wanted silence, not just from the accused, but from everyone who knew them. A nun who resisted confession, a monk who questioned scripture, a woman who taught her children to read a forbidden verse. If they refused to break, refused to recant, refused to beg, they weren't set on fire. That would make them martyrs. So instead they were sealed in, not to be seen, but to be heard just enough, just long enough to make the rest of the monastery sleep a little less easily, and that's the real purpose. Not just to destroy one body, but to haunt dozens of minds, to let every novice, every brother, every sister in that building know, this is what happens when faith strays from obedience, not with flames, but with a muffled thud. A breath you can't unhear, a scratching that follows you for the rest of your life, because that's what living death really is. You don't die all at once, you die in the ears of others. Slowly, quietly, one scratch at a time. There was no randomness to it. Every pit was planned, every seal was measured, and every soundproof wall was built not to fail. In certain monasteries and inquisitorial outposts, especially in southern France, northern Spain, and parts of Italy, hidden chambers were part of the architecture. Some were natural, a hollow beneath a cloister, a crawl space under stone flooring. Others were man-made, carved deliberately behind chapel walls, inside confessionals that backed onto solid rock, or below cells originally built for solitude and now repurposed for disappearance. The construction was simple but cruelly effective. The space needed to be just large enough for one adult to stand, or sometimes curl into fetal position. Enough air was allowed to pass, at least for a time, through a narrow vertical pipe made of reed or metal. This pipe sometimes doubled as a listening tube for clergy to hear if the prisoner had changed their mind. Often it was left open until the third day, then sealed. The entrance was typically a stone slab or wooden panel hidden behind plaster. In some cases, it was under floorboards, removed carefully and replaced once the victim was lowered inside. Mortar was applied, smoothed, dried. A few final strikes of a trowel and the person was erased. No mark, no symbol, nothing. Inside the pit, there were no torches, no blankets, no comforts of the condemned. Sometimes, to lengthen the death, a piece of moldy bread and a gourd of stale water were tossed in. This wasn't mercy, it was delay. Every extra hour meant more time to break, more time to cry out, more time to claw at stone until the fingers bled and bent in unnatural directions. Witness accounts, rare and often cloaked in euphemism, describe hearing dull thumps from under chapel floors during early morning mass. A former novice in Navarra recalled how they were taught to pray louder if the walls seemed to speak. Another manuscript from a Carmelite abbey described an event where the altar had to be riblessed because too many of the congregation had become disturbed by unholy rattling beneath their feet. What's most horrifying is that these pits weren't always in forgotten wings. In many cases, they were steps away from communal spaces, dining halls, chapels, dormitories. The location was intentional. It ensured the condemned would hear life continuing above them. Hear footsteps, laughter, psalms, hear voices of people they once ate beside, now pretending they no longer exist. And yet, sometimes the sound went the other way. People who lived above such chambers often spoke of hearing scraping at night. At first faint, rhythmic, then frantic, then nothing. The silence wasn't reassuring, it was final. It meant the scratching had stopped. Not because the wall held, but because the person within had given up. Some monks left notes, private records, not confessions, just fragments of unbearable memory. One night I prayed not for their soul, one wrote, but that I would stop hearing her cry. Another entry, it was a man, I knew his voice. They said he doubted the resurrection, I doubt it now too. No one ever opened the wall again, that was the rule. Once sealed it remained, no exhumation. No reburial, no record, only time and stone, and in some places, if you look closely, deep scratch marks, worn fingernails embedded in the brick. The pit didn't need fire, it didn't need blood, it only needed two things. A bod, and no one willing to listen. They didn't all go quietly, that's what haunts the records. There are entries, some in margins of prayer books, others in letters never sent, that speak of sounds behind stone, not demons, not ghosts. Not imagined terrors of guilty minds, but people, real people, still alive, making noise the only way they still could. In one Benedictine monastery in Navarra, Spain, a monk wrote, "We were eating in silence when it began." A slow scrape as if someone was brushing a hand across stone, then harder, like fists. The novice beside me dropped his spoon. He looked pale, but the abbot did not speak. None of us did. He goes on, by the fourth day it stopped. I pretended not to feel relief, but I did, and that's what made me sick. In another account from Toulouse, France, a nun confided to a traveling physician that she had heard whispers in the chapel, real, human whispers, coming from beneath the altar during night prayer. When she reported it, the Mother Superior told her, "That voice no longer belongs to us, let it pass." Perhaps the most chilling came from a letter never delivered, found hidden in the lining of an old breviary in an abbey archive. It was written by a young friar named Matteo. I've heard him every night this week. His name was Brother Ilias, I know because he keeps saying it. At first he begged, then he prayed. Last night he just sobbed. This morning I heard nothing. I think he died while I slept. I said nothing. I'm saying nothing now, but this is not silence. It's murder done with stone and hymns. What makes these accounts unbearable is not just what they heard, but that they did nothing. Because doing something meant questioning the church, and questioning the church, especially during the Inquisition, was a fast way to join the person inside the wall. So they stayed silent, ate their meals, prayed their psalms. Swept the floor beneath which someone clawed for help. Some may have wept in private, some may have tried to forget, but none of them opened the wall, not one. Over time, the scratching became legend, a warning passed down. If the walls speak, you do not. Some say new initiates were tested, brought into quiet chambers and told to sit in the dark. If they flinched at a sound, they were told it was the devil tempting their faith. If they asked questions, they were watched. If they listened too closely, they disappeared. In the modern era, when a restoration team began renovating a crumbling chapel in northern Italy, they discovered a sealed cavity behind the sanctuary wall. Inside was a hollow no wider than a man's arms, and on its far side, faint but unmistakable scratch marks, deep, uneven, ragged, and in one corner the imprint of a fist, bones long gone, but pressure marks still there. As if even stone had remembered what those around it had tried so hard to forget. What they heard wasn't a myth, it wasn't metaphor. It was someone dying slowly and someone else choosing not to help. And that choice, more than anything, is what makes the silence so terrifying. Because the worst sound in a place like that wasn't the scratching, it was what came after, nothing.